In the high-stakes arena of international diplomacy, few moments carry the weight of what we're witnessing right now. President Trump has issued a stark ultimatum to Iran: make a deal or face consequences worse than anything seen before. This isn't just another headline in the endless cycle of Middle East tensions. This is a defining moment that could reshape global security architecture, energy markets, and the lives of millions across multiple continents. The phrase, make a deal or face worse, reverberates through diplomatic channels from Washington to Tehran, from Tel Aviv to Brussels. What does worse actually mean? What kind of deal is even possible given decades of mistrust? And perhaps most critically, what happens if neither side blinks? Today, we're breaking down this ultimatum, examining the forces that brought us here, and analyzing what comes next in one of the world's most consequential geopolitical standoffs. The core of Trump's message is unambiguous. Iran must negotiate a comprehensive agreement or it will face escalated pressure beyond current measures. While the specific forum and exact wording of the ultimatum have been reported through various channels, the substance centers on a binary choice being presented to Tehran's leadership. The language used is deliberate. Make a deal signals openness to negotiation rather than regime change rhetoric. But face worse leaves the nature of consequences intentionally vague, a classic negotiating tactic that preserves maximum flexibility while conveying seriousness of intent. This statement didn't emerge in a vacuum. It follows a pattern of communication between Washington and Tehran that has intensified in recent weeks, with both direct and indirect diplomatic channels reportedly active despite decades of official estrangement. Iran's initial response has been characteristically defiant in public statements, with officials emphasizing sovereignty and resistance to pressure. Yet behind the scenes, diplomatic observers note that Tehran has not completely closed the door to dialogue. European intermediaries, meanwhile, have adopted cautious language, calling for de-escalation while acknowledging the complexity of bringing both sides to the table. The diplomatic vocabulary being employed by all parties suggests maneuvering is underway, even as public positions remain hardened. To understand the weight of this ultimatum, we need to trace the arc of U.S.-Iran relations, a relationship that has been fundamentally broken for more than 4 decades. The rupture began with the 1979 Islamic Revolution and the subsequent hostage crisis, which severed what had been a close alliance during the Shah's era. Since then, the two nations have existed in a state of strategic antagonism, with no formal diplomatic relations and deep mutual mistrust embedded in their political cultures. The nuclear issue became central in the early 2000s when Iran's enrichment program was revealed, triggering international concern about potential weapons development. This led to years of negotiations, sanctions, and diplomatic isolation as the international community sought to constrain Iran's nuclear ambitions. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action represented a major diplomatic breakthrough. Known as the JCPOA, or Iran Nuclear Deal, it imposed strict limits on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. The agreement involved not just the United States and Iran, but also the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, and China, reflecting the global nature of the challenge. However, the deal was controversial from the start, particularly among critics who argued it was insufficient, too permissive on timelines, or failed to address Iran's regional activities and missile programs. Sanctions have been the primary tool of U.S. pressure for decades. These measures have targeted Iran's oil exports, banking system, and access to international financial networks. The economic impact has been severe, contributing to inflation, currency devaluation, and significant hardship for ordinary Iranians. Throughout this period, Iran has maintained its own regional strategy, supporting allied groups across the Middle East and developing missile capabilities that concern neighboring states and Western powers alike. This decades-long standoff has created layers of grievance, distrust, and entrenched positions on both sides, making any new negotiation extraordinarily complex and politically fraught for leaders in both Washington and Tehran. Trump's approach to Iran during his first presidency established clear patterns that inform the current ultimatum. Understanding that track record is essential to assessing what might come next. The defining move came in 2018 when Trump withdrew the United States from the JCPOA, calling it a fundamentally flawed agreement. This decision was controversial internationally, with European allies choosing to remain in the deal, even as Washington pulled out. The withdrawal marked a dramatic shift from the multilateral diplomatic framework that had been painstakingly constructed. What followed was labeled maximum pressure, a comprehensive sanctions campaign designed to cripple Iran's economy and force a broader renegotiation. Oil exports were targeted, banking channels were severed, and secondary sanctions threatened companies that continued doing business with Iran. The economic impact was substantial, with Iran's currency collapsing and government revenues plummeting. The policy also included significant military brinkmanship. Tensions escalated repeatedly, including incidents involving tanker seizures, drone shootdowns, and attacks on Saudi oil facilities attributed to Iranian proxies. The most dramatic moment came with the strike that killed Qasem Soleimani, a senior Iranian military commander, bringing the two nations closer to open conflict than at any point in decades. Yet despite maximum pressure, no new comprehensive deal emerged during Trump's first term. Iran responded by gradually expanding its nuclear program beyond JCPOA limits, enriching uranium to higher levels and installing more advanced centrifuges. This history creates a complex foundation for current diplomacy. Trump's team demonstrated willingness to apply severe economic pressure and use military force. But the first-term experience also revealed the limits of coercion alone in achieving diplomatic breakthroughs with Tehran. Iran today operates from a position that is simultaneously stronger and weaker than it was during previous negotiating rounds, a paradox that shapes Tehran's calculus in responding to Trump's ultimatum. On the nuclear front, Iran has significantly advanced its program since the JCPOA constraints were abandoned. Enrichment levels have reached points that dramatically shorten the theoretical timeline to weapons-grade material. Advanced centrifuges have been installed and operated. Knowledge and technical capabilities have expanded. International inspectors face greater restrictions on their monitoring activities. These developments give Iran leverage. The closer to a potential weapons capability, the more urgency other nations feel about reaching an agreement. Regionally, Iran maintains an extensive network of allied militias and proxy forces across the Middle East. These groups operate in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and elsewhere, giving Tehran influence and strategic depth. This regional posture is viewed by Iran as essential deterrence and by adversaries as destabilizing aggression. Economically, however, the picture is far grimmer. Years of comprehensive sanctions have devastated Iran's economy. The currency has lost substantial value. Oil revenues, once the lifeblood of government finances, have been severely restricted. Inflation affects daily life for millions of Iranians. Infrastructure projects stall. The economic pain creates domestic pressure on Iran's leadership, though it hasn't yet translated into policy capitulation. Tehran's negotiating position reflects these cross pressures. Iranian officials demand sanctions relief and security guarantees, arguing they've been burned before by agreements that weren't honored. They insist on maintaining sovereign rights to nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. Yet the economic distress creates genuine incentive to find an off-ramp from escalation. The constraints are real. Iran's leadership must balance hardline constituencies who oppose any concessions with pragmatic voices who recognize economic collapse carries its own profound risks. Supreme leader authority remains paramount in final decisions, but even that structure must navigate complex domestic political dynamics and revolutionary ideology that frames resistance to Western pressure as existential principle. Trump's ultimatum has generated varied reactions across the international community, revealing both aligned interests and significant fractures in approach. European powers find themselves in a familiar, uncomfortable position. France, Germany, and the United Kingdom generally support preventing Iranian nuclear weapons development, but remain skeptical of ultimatum-based diplomacy. Their preference has consistently been for sustained multilateral engagement rather than maximum pressure tactics. European nations also have economic interests in maintaining some level of engagement with Iran and fear being caught between American pressure and their own strategic assessments. Israel views any serious effort to constrain Iran's nuclear program as existential priority. Israeli officials have traditionally supported tough negotiating positions with Tehran and have made clear that military options remain on their own table if diplomatic efforts fail. The threat perception in Tel Aviv is immediate and acute. Gulf Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, share Israel's concerns about Iranian regional influence and nuclear ambitions. However, some Gulf nations have recently pursued their own diplomatic openings with Tehran, complicating the coalition dynamics. They want Iranian power contained, but also seek regional stability that allows economic development. Russia and China represent a different calculus entirely. Both maintain substantial economic and strategic relationships with Iran. Neither supports aggressive Western pressure campaigns, and both have historically used their UN Security Council positions to limit international sanctions. Their involvement, or lack thereof, in any new diplomatic framework will be crucial. International bodies like the International Atomic Energy Agency continue monitoring roles, but operate within mandates that limit their political influence. The fragmented international response demonstrates that while many nations share concerns about Iranian nuclear development, there is no consensus on methods, timelines, or acceptable outcomes. Understanding the leverage dynamics between Washington and Tehran is critical to assessing how this ultimatum might resolve. The United States holds formidable economic leverage. American control over global financial systems means sanctions can effectively cut Iran off from international banking and commerce. The ability to pressure other nations and corporations to choose between American markets and Iranian business gives Washington extraordinary coercive power. Additional sanctions could target remaining economic sectors, further isolate Iranian financial institutions, or increase enforcement against sanction evasion networks. Military leverage is stark but complex. The United States possesses overwhelming conventional military superiority and could inflict devastating damage on Iranian infrastructure, military installations, or nuclear facilities. However, military action carries enormous risks, including regional conflagration, attacks on American forces and allies, disruption of global energy supplies, and uncertain political outcomes. Energy markets represent mutual vulnerability. Iran can threaten choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, through which massive oil flows pass daily. Disruption would spike global energy prices and shake economies worldwide. Yet Iran also needs eventual oil revenue restoration, limiting how aggressively it can play this card without devastating its own future economic prospects. Iran's leverage includes its nuclear advancement. The closer to weapons capability, the greater urgency others feel. Regional proxy networks give Tehran asymmetric options to impose costs without direct confrontation. Geographic position astride critical waterways provides strategic importance. And simple endurance, the ability of the regime to survive pressure, represents a form of leverage, as demonstrated over decades of sanctions. Diplomatic isolation mechanisms work both directions. The United States can pursue coalition building to enhance pressure, but Iran can exploit divisions between American and European approaches, or between Western powers and Russia or China. International legitimacy questions affect both parties differently. The leverage balance suggests neither side can simply dictate terms. Economic pain can be intensified, but hasn't yet produced capitulation. Military options exist but carry catastrophic risk. Both parties have escalation capacity, yet both also face genuine constraints. This creates conditions where negotiation becomes possible, but not inevitable. Looking forward, several distinct pathways could emerge from this ultimatum, each carrying different implications and probability weights. Negotiated settlement represents the stated goal. This would involve direct or indirect talks leading to a new framework that addresses nuclear concerns while providing Iran with sanctions relief and security assurances. The challenges are immense: defining verification mechanisms, addressing timelines, determining which sanctions lift when, and navigating domestic politics on both sides. Yet, economic pressure on Iran and Trump's expressed willingness to deal create conditions where this remains plausible. Escalated sanctions without immediate military action is a highly probable intermediate step. If negotiations stall or Iran rejects engagement, additional economic measures could target remaining sectors, increase enforcement, or pressure third countries more aggressively. This represents continuation of maximum pressure philosophy with incremental intensification. Military posturing short of full conflict could manifest through increased deployments, exercises, or limited strikes. This would signal seriousness while attempting to avoid broader war. However, the risk of miscalculation or uncontrolled escalation makes this pathway extremely dangerous. Proxy conflict escalation might see increased confrontations involving Iranian-aligned groups and American forces or allies across the region. This could occur intentionally as signaling or inadvertently through localized decisions. Such conflicts can create their own escalation dynamics independent of leadership intentions. Diplomatic stalemate remains entirely possible. Both sides maintain current positions. Sanctions continue grinding Iran's economy. Nuclear program advancement continues, and the situation persists in unstable equilibrium. This outcome satisfies neither party, but might represent the path of least resistance if negotiations fail and military options seem too risky. The ultimate pathway will likely depend on early diplomatic contacts, domestic political calculations in both capitals, and whether either side perceives genuine opportunity for acceptable agreement. The ripple effects of this ultimatum extend far beyond the bilateral U.S.-Iran relationship, touching core questions of regional stability and global order. Middle East security architecture hangs in the balance. A successful deal could reduce tensions that have fueled proxy conflicts and arms races across the region. Failure could intensify these dynamics, with neighboring states pursuing their own security arrangements, potential military buildups, and heightened risk of miscalculation leading to wider conflict. Global energy markets watch nervously. Any significant escalation affecting Gulf oil flows would impact prices worldwide, with consequences for inflation, economic growth, and political stability far from the Middle East. The mere uncertainty creates volatility that affects planning and investment. Nuclear proliferation concerns are profound. How this standoff resolves will influence other nations' calculations about pursuing nuclear capabilities. Does pressure work? Do agreements hold? Can economic coercion prevent weapons development? The answers will reverberate in capitals from Pyongyang to other regions where proliferation concerns exist. American foreign policy credibility faces testing. Can Washington construct effective coalitions? Will ultimatums produce results? How reliable are American commitments to both pressure and potential agreements? Allies and adversaries worldwide are assessing these questions, with implications for diplomatic effectiveness across numerous unrelated issues. The stakes, simply put, are global. Trump's ultimatum to Iran represents a critical inflection point in one of the world's most consequential geopolitical disputes. The choice presented, negotiate or face intensified pressure, is clear. The path forward is anything but. What we're witnessing reveals fundamental tensions in modern international relations, the limits of economic coercion, the risks of military brinkmanship, the challenges of sustaining diplomatic coalitions, and the complexity of conflicts rooted in decades of mutual grievance. Key indicators to watch include any back-channel diplomatic contacts, statements from European intermediaries, movements in oil markets, and positioning of military assets. Each will signal whether we're heading toward negotiation or escalation. Ultimately, this moment will test whether two adversaries with profound distrust can find terms both can accept, or whether we're entering a period of heightened confrontation with unpredictable consequences. The world is watching. The stakes couldn't be higher.